Minister President Markus Söder, thank you for hosting us again on our 60th anniversary, and may I ask you to take the floor.
Lieber Heusken, lieber Ischinger, meine sehr verehrten
Mr. Heusken, Mr. Ischinger, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Bavaria. We're very happy to see that you've come back to join us for this international and very important conference. 60 years of Munich Security Conference. It started as a small conference on defense matters, and at the time the newspapers reported that the people of the Cold War meeting, and in between many people thought there are no more challenges we have to look at. We talked about new topics. Sometimes we even were looking for topics to be discussed at this conference. Well, we're back to the roots, we can say that. We're back to the main topic of freedom, security, and the ability to defend each other and defend ourselves. This is why it is so important to hold this security conference. It is not just a speed dating of international politics, but it is a commitment to our joint values. The transatlantic partnership is so important for us in Germany and Bavaria as well. So let us send out messages, important messages at this conference. First of all, we stand by Ukraine. This is a war of material that both sides are waging, and it would be a disgrace for the West and for us if this were to lead to Russia's victory, if in the end Russia won because of a shortage of material. This is why it is so important to help Ukraine so they can defend not just themselves, but all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, the second point is we stand by NATO. We are committed to NATO. It is a community of values, not just a military alliance. It is an alliance of shared values. So we should not just define it in terms of money. That is important too. But NATO is not a monetary alliance. NATO has a lot to offer, a lot of benefits also to the United States of America. We have the largest US training ground here in the Federal Republic of Germany. And by the way, Ukrainian soldiers were trained there too. It's just a good feeling to see that American soldiers are here with us. And last time when they came, I received them with a Bavarian breakfast of white sausages. That's the best we have to offer, ladies and gentlemen. And the third point is, and that's an appeal to us, to Germany, we need to be strong within NATO. The President of the United States knows that we need to achieve our objectives. It's not just about the 2% pledge. Franz Josef Strauß, who used to be a defense minister, he was a member of my party, and he used to be minister president of Bavaria, and he advocated 4%. At the end, they know that Berlin is beautiful, but Munich is more beautiful. So it's a good idea to come here, and it's good to be here. Let us send out this message, a message of diplomacy. We are on.
May the force with us and live long and prosper in Bavaria. Danke, dass Sie da sind.
Thank you, Minister President. If you ask people to describe the state of the world, you hear a lot of doom and gloom. And we have reflected this in our Munich Security Report titled Lose-Lose. But we have put a question mark. We don't resign to doom and gloom. My wife and I received a New Year's card from one of MSC's most loyal guests, George Soros, which reads, "There is a silver lining somewhere, but we don't yet know where it is." So for this conference, we have asked all moderators to look in their discussions for a silver lining. Human suffering around the globe has risen to a degree my generation has probably not witnessed before. To name just a few places, the Horn of Africa, Sudan, Yemen, Haiti, Afghanistan, 1 million Rohingya remain stranded in Cox's Bazar. Russia continues its brutal assault on Ukrainians. Israelis have been hit by an inhumane terrorist attack. Around 25,000 Palestinians, most of them children and women, have lost their lives. We will try to look at all these conflicts during the next 3 days, and we will hopefully be able to identify silver linings. Many of these challenges are man-made, which means they can be changed by men and women. Let's take this anniversary conference as a chance to discuss and take steps forward. The foundation for a peaceful future can only be the rule of law and reconciliation instead of revenge. That is what has allowed my country to recover after World War II. That is what has made Western Europe enjoy its longest period of peace. And that is what global leaders wanted for the world when they established the United Nations, when they agreed on the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We will either survive thanks to the strength of the rule of law, or we will all be doomed under the rule of the strongest. The man who has dedicated his last 20 years to the preservation of our global order, of our planet, and of humanity is the Secretary General of the United Nations. Please welcome António Guterres. António, before you take the floor, I would like for you and all guests to listen to the Adagio, composed by Fanny Händel Mendelssohn, sister of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. Maestro Daniel Barenboim, the only person who holds both the Israeli and Palestinian citizenship, was so kind to send to Munich a string quartet from his West Eastern Divan Orchestra that Daniel co-founded together with Edward Said. We will listen to his son Michael, Asif Binis from Israel, Hisham Khoury from Palestine, and Mohamed Hiber from Algeria/Tunisia, who replaced Cindy Mohamed at last minute from Egypt. Daniel Barenboim, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, and this quartet have one compassion: to strive for peace and equality in the Middle East. They don't despair. There is always a silver lining.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The main program will continue momentarily.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here in Munich again. As the title of our discussion implies, today's global order is not working for everyone. In fact, I would go further and say it's not working for anyone. Our world is facing existential challenges, but the global community is more fragmented and divided than at any time during the past 75 years. Even the Cold War era was, in some ways, less dangerous. The threat of nuclear war was real and existential. That's why the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on arms reductions and controls and other mechanisms to prevent mutually assured destruction. Today, in our multipolar world, we still face the nuclear danger. And we are dealing with two more threats with existential dimensions: the climate crisis and the risks of uncontrolled artificial intelligence. And we have been unable to take effective steps to respond to any of these existential challenges. Multipolarity has created important opportunities for balance and justice and for new leadership on the global stage. But the transition to multipolarity without strong global institutions can create chaos. When power relations are vague, the dangers of aggressive opportunism and miscalculation grow. And today we see countries doing whatever they like with no accountability. Impunity seems to be the name of the game, and so we must all be determined to reestablish the primacy of the rule of law. As the Munich Security Report makes clear, relative gains through competition between countries are being prioritized over absolute gains for all through cooperation. And crises are multiplying, linked to competition and impunity. A global order that works for everyone must address these gaps and provide solutions. Excellencies, if countries fulfill their obligations under the UN Charter and international law, every person on earth would live in peace and dignity. The problem is that many governments are ignoring these commitments. Millions of civilians are paying a terrible price, and record numbers have been forced to flee. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, nothing can justify the unconscionable terror attacks launched by Hamas on 7 October against Israel. And nothing can justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Israel's military response. The situation in Gaza is an appalling indictment of the deadlock in global relations. The level of death and destruction is shocking in itself, and the war is also spilling over borders across the region and affecting global trade. The humanitarian aid operation is now on life support. It's barely functioning. Humanitarians are working under unimaginable conditions, including live fire, multiple physical obstacles and Israel restrictions, as well as the breakdown of public order. Rafah is at the core of the entire humanitarian aid operation. An all-out offensive on the city would be devastating for the 1.5 million Palestinian civilians there who are already on the edge of survival. I've repeatedly called for an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and a humanitarian ceasefire. That is the only way to massively scale up aid delivery in Gaza. And this must be the foundation for concrete and irreversible steps towards a two-state solution based on international law and United Nations resolutions. Excellencies, the war triggered by Russian invasion of Ukraine in clear violation of the UN Charter has no place in Europe of the 21st century. 2 years in, the cost in human lives and suffering is appalling, and the impact on the global economy has been particularly devastating for developing countries. We desperately need a just and sustained peace for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. But a peace in line with UN Charter and international law, which establishes the obligation to respect the territorial integrity of sovereign states. And around the world, from the Sahel to Libya and Sudan, from the Great Lakes to the Horn of Africa, from Yemen to Myanmar, we need concerted efforts to strengthen regional organizations and for global powers to pressure the parties to the war to come to the peace table and pursue their goals through negotiations. The recent decision of the Security Council to support African Union-led peace-enforcing and counter-terrorism operations is an important step in the right direction. Excellencies, beyond this immediate crisis, we need to strengthen the global peace and security architecture to deal with today's threats and challenges. Those who drafted the UN Charter did not conceive of the climate crisis, artificial intelligence, or cyber weapons. The new agenda for peace, to be discussed at the Summit of the Future in September, aims to update our collective security systems based on a more networked and inclusive multilateralism for a world in transition. From reform of the UN Security Council, to a recommitment to eliminating nuclear weapons and the role of sustainable development and climate action in preventing conflict, the new agenda for peace seeks to update global commitments for the challenges of today and tomorrow. It includes measures to prevent the further fragmentation of global trade rules, supply chains, and more. And it calls for new norms and frameworks to regulate new technologies in the military domain. Excellencies, competition at the global level cannot obscure the divisions we see around us. Communities are driven by hate speech, discrimination, and deepening polarization. Truths and facts are being drained of all meaning in an age of deep fakes and disinformation. We are witnessing an intolerable explosion of anti-Semitism and other forms of religious and racial hatred. Divided societies are weak societies, where extremist narratives can take hold and tensions quickly escalate into violence, undermining democratic values. Tech companies should assume their responsibilities and stop profiting from the amplification of toxic content of all kinds. And we need a new emphasis on social cohesion and the security of every individual through a renewed social contract based on justice and inclusion and anchored in human rights. And this will be the focus of the World Social Summit we will host next year. Excellencies, now we come to the pie of the next discussion, the global economy. Everyone is fighting for a piece of that pie. But zero-sum mindsets mean everyone may get zero, increasing threats to security and prosperity for all. We need peace with justice. Today's global financial architecture, based on frameworks agreed nearly 80 years ago, is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. It has failed the world's poorest countries still suffering the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. They will owe more in debt service this year than their public spending on health, education, and infrastructure combined. And unfortunately, we still lack an effective debt relief mechanism. All this is a development emergency with deep implications for global security. We need urgent action in two areas: a stimulus of $500 billion annually in affordable long-term finance for developing countries to invest in the Sustainable Development Goals as endorsed by the UN General Assembly in September. And we are working with a small group of heads of state to champion and monitor its implementation. And we need a new Bretton Woods movement to reform the global financial architecture so that it corresponds to today's global economy and is able to create a true global safety net, in particular for developing countries drowning in debt. The Summit of the Future will consider the need for deep reforms to make these institutions and frameworks truly universal and inclusive and based in the rule of law. This is essential to create a global economy that works for everyone, everywhere. Excellencies, finally, we must end our war with nature. The climate crisis is gathering pace. Last year was the hottest on record. It would be the coolest for many years to come. The next few years are decisive. Emissions must have peaked by next year, 2025, and must fall by 45% by 2030. We have the tools. We know what to do. We need to progressively phase out fossil fuels and promote a just and equitable transition to renewable energy, led by the G20 countries that are responsible for 80% of global emissions. The next 2 years must see ambitious national determined contributions, national climate plans from every country covering every sector. And we also need to triple global renewable energy capacity, double energy efficiency by 2030, and unlock the necessary finance for developing countries from public and private sources so that they can meet the growing demand for electricity with the infinite clean energy of renewables. All financial commitments made by developed countries in support of climate action, both in mitigation and adaptation, must be met. Excellencies, it is clear that our world is in deep trouble. Global governance in its present form is entrenching divisions and fueling discontent. We must work based on justice with renewed urgency and solidarity. There is always an opportunity to create a more inclusive, comprehensive, and effective global order that works for everyone based on international law. A safer world and a bigger pie for all. That is the objective of the UN Summit of the Future in September. Let's seize the opportunity, and I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your speech, and I think everybody here is behind me supporting you for the Summit of the Future, for the goal to establish a global order that works for all. I'm now very happy to announce the panelists of our first panel today at the Munich Security Conference, and I'd like to welcome Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. Thank you very much for joining us for a second time, please. I would like also to welcome Nanu Akufo-Addo, the President of Ghana, regular, and thank you very much for again joining us here in Munich, Mr. President. And then for the first time, in the MSC history, we have President of Colombia, Mr. Gustavo Petro Urrego, who on very short notice decided to come here. Thank you. Usually at the Munich Security Conference, we have in the last days cancellations. In this case, the ambassador of Colombia called me 2 days ago to say the president of Colombia wants to come and join you here. And we are very grateful that you took this long journey to come here. Mr. President, I would like to go back to the theme of the opening, the question of reconciliation. You heard the orchestra, the quartet, and you come yourself from a country that many citizens were victims of terrorism. And in your country, you chose the way, the pathway also to reconciliation. And when we see the many conflicts that we have, and we had at our kickoff session on Monday, the foreign minister of Rwanda, who told us about after the genocide that happened, they chose the way of reconciliation instead of revenge. Can you tell us a bit how Colombia has managed, and also on your views for an international summit for peace?
Bien, gracias.
Thank you very much. Well, in a world that talks about war, Colombia speaks about peace. And it's not the first time. We have a conflict, an armed conflict, that has been with us for 75 years. It has different colors, but it's still with us. It changes, but it's always there. And there's no country that you can build up when people kill themselves during 75 years. Why? Well, because we're one of the countries that is so unequal. We have slavery regime that we inherited, and we had slavery in our country, and we kept these anti-democratic structures in our economy, in our mentality, in our society. So, if you want to know what I think about reconciliation and how we can project this idea on a planetary level, then I have to say that we have to build social justice. And we have said this so many times, it's not a new idea, but Colombia could find peace step by step during the last 30 years. And I will tell you a statistical example. One of our cities had 400 homicides per 100,000 citizens. It's 16 today. It's still high, but it's lower than 25 or 30 years ago. So how can you achieve this appeasement? With jails? With bombs? Well, we have had bombs thrown on children in Colombia. Genocide? Well, in Colombia, there has been genocide. We have had a very strong violation of human rights in our society by people of our own society. So what is the one thing that has worked? Social justice. So we need to have less causes for economic inequality. We need to try that in a country that is so beautiful, so diverse as Colombia, the own society, the own human diversity can exist in dignity. So this fight between one vision and another vision, between a bomb thrown on children or jail, or maybe it's a construction of a justice pact in a country. So we have had different political opinions since we had started our constitution in 91. So statistically seen, we have not achieved to have less violence, but we have built social justice.
Thank you very much for this social justice. Mia Mottley, thank you very much for joining us here again. You are one of the greatest advocates for reforming global governance. especially in the area of climate finance, a theme that the Secretary General also included in his speech. The Munich Security Conference has selected you this year as one of the 2 recipients of its Ewald von Kleist Award. Thank you for joining us. Can you dwell a bit on what the Secretary General already touched upon, and that is, how do we fix the international financial institutions that they tackle the most challenging, most urgent challenges like climate change, and how do we make sure that they really benefit the countries that are most affected, even the smallest one?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the award this year. I take it not for myself, but really as an example of those of us who have tried to create a voice where none has existed. And that's exactly what is needed in the multilateral system, to be able to allow for voices to be heard and people to be seen. I think that the Secretary General's comments have been continuous, forthright. So you ask yourself, how is it not happening? Well, geopolitics, domestic politics, and a failure simply to act. There is no more knowledge that is needed to be able to allow decisions to be made. And the question is, therefore, why aren't we getting the decisions taken that will make the difference to people's lives, that will make the difference to us being able to save the planet? And some of it is not even always with malice, but some of it is just benign. Take the European Union deforestation regulations. I don't think that anyone, when those regulations were settled, intended to be able to harm anyone. But the reality is that because of the complex nature of bureaucracy that is involved in it, and the links to smartphones, etc., you're effectively ruling out millions of people in Africa from being able to participate legitimately in the sale of their produce. And that this therefore means that the business that would have been occasioned for them as a result of large multinational corporations will go elsewhere. Now, the Chancellor of this country stood out last year when he indicated very boldly that we have to change the economic construct that saw the extraction of commodities without value from particularly the global south. But it can't be the voice of one or two in speeches or conferences such as this. And what the global system misses is an effective mechanism for decision making. You talk about climate finance, but it's not just climate finance. I've said over and over, it's a whole range of global public goods. Because take, for example, with respect to the European Union deforestation regulation, it's intended to be able to help save the planet. But you can't work good for the planet and do bad for the people. Because at the end of the day, if the people can't live, and the people can't have peace, and the people can't have prosperity, then you have a barren planet. So that I think that something is fundamentally wrong with a system that does not provide for an occasion. The UN definitely gives us the opportunity to talk, but we have to find an executive framework that allows decisions to be taken in a more timely manner. And why? The Secretary General pointed out this afternoon, the climate crisis is not waiting on us, even as we solve the problems of Palestine and Israel, of Haiti, of Africa, with respect to the disruptions in sub-Saharan Africa within the last few years. Equally, unbridled and unregulated artificial intelligence is not waiting for somebody to stop it from going, and it's continuing to literally inform how businesses do business and products that they develop. We cannot afford the luxury anymore of a failure of regulation and a failure of decision making. And too much, regrettably, is as a result of geopolitics and as a result of domestic politics. And by the time we wake up and are ready to do it, the consequences may be too far and for us to bring back.
Thank you for this so clear demand for effective mechanisms. President Akufo-Addo, we are very grateful that again you come here to the Munich Security Conference, despite the fact that actually you should be on your way to Addis Ababa to the summit of the African Union, and we really appreciate your being here. Picking up of what the Prime Minister just said, can regional organization, can the African Union work closer together, coordinate their political will more so that they are more effective in actually seeing to it that what Mottley asked for is implemented? Can the African Union coordinate better also other continents so that when the summit of the future happens, there is more countries speak with one voice, like the EU is speaking with one voice on many occasions? Can you also do that and therefore make a difference and make the summit in the summer of a success?
So, Dr. Houston, thank you very much once again for inviting me. This is the second time, and I appreciate it very much. Congratulate you also on your 60th edition. 60 is a big number, and it's good that you're here. I think that the African Union, I mean, the context of your question, the African Union does speak on one voice on many, many critical matters. But the African Union is representing states that are amongst some of the weakest and the poorest in the world. And their capacity to change the context of the world is relatively limited. Many of the things that have to be done cannot be done by the African Union. It can be done by the African Union in concert with others if others also share the same perspectives. And I believe that that is the biggest issue confronting all of us. To what extent is there a certain universality in the sharing of values and the sharing of solutions? Growing the pie. Growing the pie is in itself not sufficient to deal with the problems that the world has. Growing the pie and seeing to it that there's a more equitable distribution of the pie is a critical factor in being able to ensure that the 21st century is in fact a century where there will be what we're not seeing in this first part of the 20th century, of the 21st century, peace and order in the globe. That is going to be made possible when the sharing of, not just the growing of the pie, but the sharing of the pie is taking place on a more equitable basis. And I think that that is at the heart of the discussions that all of us should have, because a situation whereby the so-called global South, where Africa features, is always at the wrong end of the stick in terms of its takeout of global assets, cannot be a way forward for an orderly state of humanity. It cannot work. It's not possible for us to maintain the paradigm where one part of the world is privileged and comfortable, and the other part of the world is suffering and is under constant threat of starvation, malnutrition, and the rest. We have to have a paradigm that recognizes that for there to be peace and order in our world, we also have to have a certain mental revolution that has to take place, especially amongst the rich people of the world. Has it to be that in order for one part of the world to prosper, the other part of the world has to be impoverished or poor? Is that a necessary equation for the 21st century? I don't believe it is. I believe it is possible for us, especially when you look at the huge advances that we're making in technology across all areas of the world, whether in health, in agriculture, in the manner in which financial instruments work, that it should be possible for us to construct a world on a better principle than what we have had up till today. We can grow the pie, critical, but we can also look at how that pie can be shared on a more equitable basis. And I believe if the focus amongst all of us is there, we can then create the institutions at the global level that will make it possible. As it is today, global financial institutions, global governance institutions are all working in a way to preserve the structure of the world as it is today. And it has turned out not to be a very satisfactory world because of the manner in which these institutions work. So if indeed our goal is to create a pie that works for everyone, then the reform of these global institutions has to be an imperative necessity for our time. When I'm talking about the manner in which the Security Council works and United Nations work, we're talking about how the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, the multilateral development organizations work. There is the need for some fundamental reforms in the way in which these organizations work. I mean, we are seen in our own eyes, for instance, as far as the Security Council, which is meant to be the principal organ for the maintenance of international peace and security, has become paralyzed by its very structure and nature. The body that should be taking the most prominent role in trying to bring these various wars to bear cannot, because the main protagonists of these wars are the veto-wielding powers of the Security Council. That cannot be a satisfactory way in which this world can work. And we see it in other areas of the global system. So the question then comes back, and it's the same. The African Union, in many, many cases, has found it possible, and indeed necessary, to speak with one voice on critical matters. But its interlocutors, are these interlocutors also prepared to find a way to meet the African Union halfway, to be able to deal with these issues, these fundamental issues of the reform of the... Because the global financial architecture, for instance, is a major barrier to the ability of the states of Africa to be able to participate in growing the pie in an effective manner. So that would be my response.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Before we turn to the public, Secretary General, can I ask you a question? I think when you listen to the two presidents, the Prime Minister, they totally back what you have said before, what you ask for. Now, when you go to the streets of Munich or probably most of the cities in Europe, and when you say there is this summit of the future coming, which is really the one summit that is key also on the way to implement sustainable development goals, you'll have many people who don't know about this, and somehow it is not in daily politics. You were a Portuguese politician, 20 years ago. You know about domestic politics. How do we succeed in having the topics that were mentioned here, the topics that are the key topics for this world, for this planet to survive? How do we get this in the daily political life, on the agenda of day-to-day politics, also nationally?
Well, I think it's very important to do our best to avoid the kind of technocratic political language that nobody really understands, and to speak in a way that everybody can be able to analyze the problems that exist and to fight for the solutions that are necessary. Let us speak in relation to some of the issues that were raised here. The importance of the rule of law. we live in societies that are more and more polarized, more and more divided. We live in a continent where war came back. So we need to be able to explain the importance of human rights and the importance of the rule of law based on the problems that we are facing in our own societies, the polarization, and on the fact that war came back to Europe. On the other hand, when I was Prime Minister, as you mentioned, we lived in the glorious moment of globalization. And we thought globalization would solve all problems. And it's true that inequalities were growing in relation to people, but in relation to countries, developing countries were catching up. And until very recently, Africa, for instance, for 10 years was the continent in which the growth rates were higher. But we need to be able to explain, when we discuss how important it is to reform the international financial system, we need to be able to explain to people what has happened in a way that people can understand. Now, here in Germany, as in Portugal, when the COVID came, we were able to print a lot of money to support the populations. And the United States printed more than $1 trillion. And all developed countries were able to print money. Developing countries could not print money, so they increased their debt. And how they increased their debt, when afterwards the war in Ukraine came, prices went up, interest rates went up, and they are now in a terrible debt trap. Now, we can explain this to people looking into the family economy. What has happened to the world is exactly what has happened to some of the families that live in our societies, that have their mortgages, that now pay higher interest rates, that have seen prices go up more quickly. And to make them understand that if these problems we are facing in our societies, I'm talking now about Europe, are dramatic for many of us, to the extent that populists are making a lot of success, as we know, in their campaigns, they are even much more dramatic to countries that could not have the instruments of support of populations that we had in our own societies. I think we need to translate our wish to reform the Security Council, to reform the Bretton Woods system, to reform the international financial architecture into things that people can understand because they are related to their daily life. Unfortunately, most of the political debate is a political debate in such a way that people do not understand. And then come the populists with very simple ideas that are totally wrong, that will lead to no solution, but that people understand and tend to follow with the threats to our democracies that we are witnessing now everywhere.
Thank you.
I wonder if I can come in here, because the Secretary General has made a very relevant point about keeping communications simple. For the longest time, we have been arguing through the Bridgetown Initiative and others that let's take debt. We just heard about the explosion of the problem of debt around developing countries like a millstone because of the pandemic, because of the increased prices coming after the Ukraine war. But yet, the international financial institutions will want you to go on a debt trajectory that says that your debt sustainability should be anchored 60% debt to GDP. Well, in truth and in fact, every country in Europe is now, I think, on or about 90%. And the only reason you probably haven't changed it is because of the difficulty in how you change a treaty. What this means is that countries like ours are kept on a trajectory that does not allow us to make the investments that are necessary to boost education, to boost healthcare, to reduce the chances of social implosion and the lack of security that will take more than a generation to recover from. And yet what it requires is just simply people speaking and agreeing to new metrics at the level of the international financial institutions. Let's take insurance. The biggest problem that the world is not looking at, in my view, with respect to the climate crisis, is how the climate crisis is going to make the microeconomy effectively dysfunctional, and how it's going to be difficult for homeowners to be able to get insurance in certain districts in the world. Insurance was meant to manage risk, but when risk now becomes certain, what's happening in California with wildfires, what's happening in Florida and Virginia Beach is only a microcosm of what will happen in the Caribbean. But at least in the States, in the United States of America, they can move to a different state. Tell me where in the Caribbean they're going to move to as a sovereign country. When Montserrat, with the volcanic eruptions, effectively had to take people out, people had to go to the UK, and when they went to the UK, they did not even have equal rights and status as people who were born in Britain. So this world has to confront the fact that the climate crisis is going to make certain regions uninvestable, and if they become uninsurable, they're going to become uninvestable. And therefore, we're going to start to be able to see climate migration and more insecurity in a way that we have not bargained for, and especially in neighborhoods that are frightened for migration.
Thank you for this. I'm getting signed that
Dr.
we are
Houston, if I may
that we are running out of time. Can I ask the two presidents for a 1 minute statement on that? And sorry, but President Pedro asked for the floor before. 1 minute, and then President Ghana 1 minute, please.
Yo pienso que
Well, I think that a state of crisis gives you the feeling that there is something falling down. So a paradigm has come to its end, and it depends on us how we move forward or don't move forward. A paradigm is that the way that we have governed the last 40 years, that the market would lead us to wealth. But the reality today is that it has not been that way. We are close to extinction, so it's the contrary. This feeling of extinction, that the idea of progress has ended, can lead us to barbarity, like in 1933, where we have seen an indirect genocide and we cannot do anything. Or maybe we're part of it. So it's a start. It's not a solution, it's a start. And all of our countries in the south can start with it. So people are leaving our countries because there is no water. We have drought, and people move to the north, and then we see that there is more water there because the ice is melting. But behind the crisis, we have the climate crisis, and caused by the market, and this leads to barbarity. It leads to fascism. It leads to destruction of the democratic values for all the humanity. There is another way out, a possible way out, which could be a democratic pact. Africa and South America, we both have a very, very big potential for clean energies, the biggest potential in the world. And we can see it as a pact. So maybe you have the chimney that throws out CO2 and has led us, or is leading us, to barbarity, and we have the clean energy. So what can we do? Will we go to war? Will we throw bombs? Or will we sign a democratic pact between North and South, between humanity? With strengthening another paradigm, that is that market alone will not lead us to wealth. It will lead us to abysm. So we need a really public force, and this public force needs to be global. It cannot be national. So a public global force, a democratic force, and that means the change of the relationships, of the power relation. So if we want to maintain our current situation, then we would measure power, like how many bombs has someone, or planes. But another way would be to see votes. Today we have voted against war. So why don't they listen to us? Because they have more planes? That would lead to barbarity. More vote is democracy, civilization, and humanity.
you for this. Unfortunately, President, we have to stop because our program is running already a bit late, and we have to stay on time. So I think that also the President of Colombia spoke also on behalf of you. So thank you very much for this. Mr. Secretary General, please leave for New York via Africa with the feeling that you have a lot of support for the success of the Summit of the Future. It is as urgent as ever. We need this effective multilateralism. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the President. Thank you for the Prime Minister for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The main program will continue momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated.